Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this. Thank you, Bill Power, for hosting it, helping with all of this. My mom and I really appreciate it. I've been going through a lot of my dad's things, and I discovered that he kept every card that I ever made him. And in each one, he is wearing a tie and holding a briefcase, because even when I was little, I knew that his work and dressing for work was very important to him. In fact, here's a drawing that I made when I was 7 that is my interpretation of him at the Wall Street Journal. So giving a eulogy is already a challenge, especially when the person was such a part of you, and that this is an especially odd way to deliver one. But it got me thinking about my dad's relationship with technology, and I'd like to tell you a little story because I think it illustrates some things about him and our relationship. I was in middle school when the internet started to become a household utility. My dad wasn't a Luddite, but he definitely liked to do things the way he always liked to do them. So he wasn't an early adopter either. But he loved music. In fact, on the day I was born, he went to a place that would make mix cassettes of anything that you wanted, and he made one for me. Eventually, these businesses got shut down due to copyright trouble, but I still have the tape. Track 1, side A, is Girls Just Want to Have Fun by Cyndi Lauper. When it came to music, he was an early adopter. I was very into downloading music illegally in middle school, but back then lots of songs were mislabeled. So even though I thought I had downloaded Sugar Ray, I ended up downloading a song called Just Walk Away, Renee by the Left Bank. My dad heard me playing it and said, "How did you get this? This is from when I was in high school. Why are you even listening to this? It's terrible." And I explained, this is Napster. You can download anything in the whole world. And he couldn't believe it. He said, "There's absolutely no way it's everything in the whole world." And he looked at me rather bemused. I feel like some of you can probably picture the look. And I thought that was that. But an hour later, he came back with a whole list of songs that he wanted to see if I could download. These were songs he actually liked from when he was younger, and he thought I would like them too. I vividly remember what they were. "The Message to You, Rudy" by the Specials, "Bang a Gong" by T-Rex, and "I Say Yeah Yeah" by Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames. It took 2 full days to download all of them because of internet speed, but once I got them, he was so excited. Napster got into its own copyright trouble, but it kicked off a whole new way for us to relate. I started to burn him CDs of songs I was listening to, and he would tell me what was good about it, and then have me make another CD that was more to his taste. I made him these mixes until YouTube came out. When I explained it wasn't for just dumb videos and you could listen to music on it, it was revelatory for him. I'd come home for visits and we'd stay up late and he'd play me things and tell me about his life. How this video of the Stooges live was not as good as when he saw them at the Fillmore East with his friends. And that would lead to conversations about all the shows he saw and what he was like when he was young. He said Don Henley wasn't as bad as I claimed he was because he had a lot of fond memories of listening to his solo stuff when he got together with my mom. But he still agreed that the Eagles were garbage. Once I started thinking about what a major and positive impact the evolution of the internet has had on our relationship, it made me appreciate what an amazing time he just passed through. There are downsides to it, of course, but my dad would remind me that we are lucky. When pandemics happened at any other time in the past, we weren't able to connect this way. And I wouldn't have been able to quickly throw together a playlist of his favorite music to play for him in the hospital while we said goodbye. I was so lucky to have a dad like him. I know he passed away knowing how lucky he was that he did. You were all a part of it. Thank you. We're going to have a little video that shows the other side of my father's life when he wasn't working. It was by Rolling Pin Film Productions, and I hope you guys enjoy that in addition to hearing some people speak about Richard today. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bill. Thank you.
How old are you? How old are you?
Cow.
Cow, I knew you're a cow. How old are you? 3, 2, 1.
All right. I think time for Matt Murray, the Journal's editor-in-chief, to say a few words.
Well, good morning, everybody. As Bill said, I'm Matt Murray. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal. It's really something to see so many familiar faces out there, so many colleagues from so many years at the Journal. I should say Jan and Nora, everybody who's with you on the call this morning is so sorry to be with you today for an occasion like this, for the sadness of thinking about Rich, who was taken from us much too soon. But I also know there's a lot of people who are happy to celebrate Rich and to thank you for hearing him with us for so many years on what I knew were a lot of long days, late nights, and even some weekends. You've talked about Rich at home. I think it falls on me a little bit to talk about Rich at work some. And it has to be said at the starting point that he was someone who didn't just stand for the very best of our profession and the best kind of person in it, but somebody who shared wisdom and influence with all of us, everybody on this call, literally hundreds of us every day and over many decades. In the note that I sent to the newsroom to share the news of his passing, I wrote that he was the sort of person we all went into journalism to meet. And that's really true. I think all the speakers today are going to testify to that. I'm only really one of hundreds who was made better by his character and talents over many decades. I'm also one of those, I should say, who both worked for Rich and who later he worked for. But in a real sense, I think wherever you stood in that relationship, he was like the boss. He was the one you wanted to impress. You wanted his approval because always that meant that you were doing okay because of Rich's high standards. It's funny to call him Rich. Regis, of course, is what he called himself. And I'll try to call him that out of respect for now on. He was at the Journal for 34 years. He came here in 1981 after winning a big award at the Staten Island Register. He had a number of different roles here. He was one of the last of the traditional West News columnists. He worked on Page One. He worked on Heard on the Street. But really, for me, I think for most of us, what stands out is the many hats he wore over the years, sitting in the center of the newsroom on the news desk, where he was the rock for a long time, for many years in different configurations and under different bosses. He was an intimidating presence, I can attest. The first time you met him or saw him could be a little bit terrifying. Kathy Panagoulias, I don't know if Kathy's on today, but who was his boss for a long time and worked closely with him, as she remembers, for years. His name was on every story and memo sent to New York. He was on a last name basis with everyone, including himself. His phone would ring, he'd pick up and bark, "News desk, Regis," into it. He'd listen, and with his back ramrod straight, he would turn to his keyboard and start typing. He was a very fast typist. Typing, barking, instructing, questioning, barking, clarifying, joking, barking, as Kathy puts it. What you got to see a little bit with a little bit of time with Rich was that there was also an incredibly generous soul there, a very self-aware sense of humor, who was very amused by the Daily Carnival, and maybe the sharpest Renaissance mind in the room. Snazzy dresser, a connoisseur of food and art, and someone who really valued his family. It's for years, it seemed like Regis was always there in the middle of the room, always ready to talk jazz with the Knicks, talk stories, to give feedback on a lead, to call bullshit on another story, to give you no frills career advice. I think it seems like he hated meetings, he hated bureaucracy. So in my memory, it wasn't uncommon to come to the news desk at different times of the day, and Rich would be the only one who'd be there, even as a manager. Always there, always writing the news and going over the paper very, very, very carefully. It's hard to understate the authority he had. While he could raise his voice occasionally, I think what really resonated was the steely gaze. And in fact, I saw it on the photo at the beginning of the service today. He always had what I think of as a measured urgency and knowledge in every conversation. He wasn't a big time waster. So all day, stories all over the journal filtered through Rich. All day, reporters and editors were calling him. Cut to the chase was one of the stock phrases. He wanted to know the news, what you had, if you could back it up. You really couldn't bullshit him, and I tried more than once. He knew all the stories in the paper, he knew all the news in the world. He also knew how to make you look smarter and better than maybe you were, as he focused with precision and detail on every story and every phrase. He also remembered what you'd written the last time, and he'd make sure that the relevant background from your old stories was in this time. One way I think about Rich, he didn't suffer fools. He worked harder than anybody to make sure you didn't look like a fool. I wish right now to this day that I had quite his mix of exacting high standards and personal sympathy for the task every day of the reporter. Now, I know there's some non-journalists here, so I should explain probably that editing within the context of a newsroom is rarely seen as particularly glamorous. Reporters tend to look down on editors, even feel sorry for them a little bit. Newsrooms are pretty famous for running on ego and adrenaline, usually measured in bylines. And editors are often seen as the supporting players in that drama, or even worse, as obstacles. I don't think Regis was ever seen that way by anybody. He was much more like the hub around which the spokes of the journal turned all day. He was always here early in the morning and late at night, often working feverishly on deadline to make the stories hold up. And he was always drawn to the most talented and ego-driven reporters in the newsroom. During parts of his career, the names in the journal were breaking stories left and right, people like Steve Lippin and Jeff Cole. The best names in journalism, some of the most demanding. Rich worked with all of them. They all trusted him. He never took a byline, but he left fingerprints on all those stories. And one of the things all those reporters had in common was him. He was the one always on the phone, holding their feet to the fire, and also looking out for them. He did that for a lot of people. What you got to see with Rich over time, as I did when I came to New York and worked alongside him too, was that he was really like a Wall Street Journal encyclopedia. He knew the standards, he knew the stories, but he also knew the tricks and the quirk of every member of the staff. And it was hard sometimes not to think those thick glasses weren't X-ray specs. As I also noted, I sent to the newsroom, at the end of the day, it's really people like Rich who make institutions like this one last and thrive over time. And he was a key figure here for so many decades in getting us to where we are today. Now, I haven't said this, but it has to be said. Finally, how often conversations with Rich ended with him laughing. He had one of the genuine, enthusiastic laughs you ever heard. It was husky. He would squint with joy. And that's often how I think of Rich a lot out there. You know, he could be very serious. His presence could be very focused. Even then, you could always see the sparkle in his eyes from the excitement of being right at the center of the action, right where he wanted to be, doing what he wanted to do. Raju Narisetti, our longtime colleague, my friend going back now almost 30 years, Shared a couple of stories of Rich interacting and his humor with Andy Sobel, another colleague of ours. Andy shared with Raju. So as Andy says, you know, he was terrified of Rich at first, as many of us were. And then, like most of us got to know him, he got to see humor, the dryness, the directness that the side of Rich. So he shared a couple of typical Regis interactions, which I think we've all shared. So very often in the news desk, they'd be there at the end of a long day, having put the paper to bed, feeling very good about themselves. It's an intense thing to produce a product like that every day. One day when they were there, as Rich said to Andy, "What'd you do this weekend?" Andy's answer, "We went to the Museum of Modern Art. I just don't understand those paintings. Splotch on a canvas or a dot on a canvas, 10 million bucks. I could have done that." Rich said, "You didn't. They did." That was very Rich, I think, in a nutshell. Another time, Andy's saying, "I ate veal last night. I felt squeamish about it now." "Why?" Rich asks. "Because it's got a heart and it was alive, so I have to think it had feelings. I took it from his mother." Rich succinctly says, "You're an idiot." Andy says, "No, really, it died for me." And of course, Rich says, "It wouldn't have lived in the first place if we didn't eat it." That kind of humor, that kind of cut right to the chase and the heart of the matter was very typical of Rich and his interactions all day. A final thought, I think, that I'm sure others are going to talk about today, and a devastating thought, but Rich was one of the bravest people, maybe the bravest person any of us will ever know. On 9/11, of course, he was in at the office early because the planes hit the towers shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. So he was at his post. He evacuated the building at the same bus as Paul Steiger, the editor at the time. It was just as the smoke was starting to clear from the towers, as Paul remembers. Both of them covered head to foot with the same white powder. As we know, within days, Rich was in the hospital with that vasculitis, and it was very serious. He was given the last rites multiple times and had a long recovery. He didn't come back to the Journal newsroom for a year. And when he did return, you could see the toll. He was a little slower, he was a little thinner. He looked like a heavyweight who'd been through a really punished 12-round bout. It's hard in some ways not to think about that because we know the toll that day eventually had on Rich's life. But what I really remember is all of the times after that. He spent 13 more years in the middle of this newsroom that he loved. He was here every day. He was the same precise and exacting editor with the same sense of humor. He had the same care about the stories and the products made every day. He had the same liveliness, the same interest in the news, and he mentored dozens more editors and people across this newsroom while enforcing standards for the Journal during a tumultuous time. You always knew he'd been through a lot, but you didn't know what because he didn't really talk or complain about it or moan. He just came here every day. He did his job and he was dedicated here till the day he left. All of us were incredibly lucky and fortunate to have his presence here for 13 years. You know, it was something to see him here every day. It was like a living monument to history in our newsroom. So Jan and Nora, we want to thank you for sharing Rich with us for all those years and for all the extra years. I hope you know how much he means to so many people, and I hope you know how much his spirit still animates the hallways and the desks of this newsroom, and how that will always be the case, and how much we're all grieving with you in your loss.
Thanks, Matt. That's awesome. If Charlie Reina is on, he is the retired radio broadcaster who knew Regis since he was 3. So he's going to say a couple remarks. Let me
Hi,
oh, you're on? Good.
hi, that's me, Charlie Reina. I wasn't as close to Richard or spend as much time with him as just about all of you did. However, I think I could safely say that with the exception of his sister, Linda, who I understand has joined us, I probably have known him, not an everyday acquaintanceship, but I've known him longer than anyone else. In 1983, when Janet invited my wife and me and a number of other people, some from the Associated Press, which is where I met and worked with Janet, and also I'm pretty sure from the Journal. We were, all in attendance, and she introduced Rich as her fiance, and said, turned to Rich and said, you and Charlie have something in common. You both lived in Staten Island when you were very young. And Rich said, oh, where, Charlie? Did you? I said, South Beach. He said, so did I. I spent a lot of time in South Beach. He said, where in South Beach? I said, well, it was a combination bungalow, summer bungalow, and permanent residences on Seaside Boulevard, run by Mr. Florio. He said, that's where we stayed. And I said, what's your last name, Rich? He said, Regis. I said, Regis, I'm the guy who, now we're going to freeze frame there and go back about 54 years to 1956, or 34 years to 1956. And Rich and his family used to, although they lived elsewhere in Staten Island, spent the summers in this bungalow colony, which was right across the street from the beach, from South Beach. And I lived in one of the permanent houses that fronted along Robin Road. In any case, my parents and George and Rose Regis, Rich's parents, became friends and saw a lot of each other. In this summer of '56, I was just about ready to turn 8 years old, and Rich had just turned 4, I believe. And he was, to me, he was a pesky little kid who couldn't get out of my head. I very often was bored and would take a stickball bat and my little Spalding and go out into the sort of the common area between the 2 rows of bungalows, and I would, whack the ball, and much to the consternation of the landlord, Mr. Florio, who would come out and speak, in his broken English, stop, you're going to hurt somebody. Stop that, I'm going to tell you to do something nice. Okay, I listened, and one day I took my stickball bat and Spalding, and, as you throw the ball up and you swing at it, well, I did that, and I missed the ball, but I heard the thwack anyway. And as it turned out, little Richard, at the age of almost 4, had walked up behind me, and I hit him right in the eye with the bat. And he, of course, laid writhing in pain and screaming. And I started to go to him, but as I did, I could see Mr. Florio coming down with, fist raised and yelling all kinds of things. And it scared me so much that I regrettably just turned and ran. And I ran to my house and I hid under my bed. Out of it, but I can make myself, if that's okay. We probably saw more of Rich and his family after that. I don't recall. And I never did see him again until Janet introduced us in 1983. And, the odd thing about it was that Rich and I had both followed similar paths in our lives after this, both wound up in the same profession. I'd come to Manhattan from having lived in Staten Island earlier on and so on, jobs in the same profession, and eventually met and got acquainted with a young woman named Janet Brandstrader. So since that time, we A couple of times a year, Janet and Rich would come over, particularly on Christmas Eve. So we have seen each other. And of course, Rich would be really tired of hearing this story over and over. So I just say this one last time. And I am confident in one thing, that eventually I will see Rich again, and he'll be there, no doubt, holding a stickball bat over his shoulder. Thanks.
That's one of my little favorite anecdotes we learned. Our next speaker is going to be Raju, which we're going to show on tape, followed by Kathryn Kranhold and Christine Glancey. So.
My earliest memory of Regis was getting a phone call in the Pittsburgh bureau, the usual Regis, and then you have the pit in your stomach because you know it's not going to be an easy conversation. I had filed a corporate focus which had said that companies were complaining they can't find workers. And there was Regis telling me he doesn't buy the story. And the reason he didn't buy the story was because he felt like companies were not looking hard enough, or they were doing things not to find workers. And we went back and forth. He made me do more reporting. And I still remember 25 years later, the headline of the story was, in the end, manufacturers decry a shortage of workers while rejecting many. And in the end, he was right. These companies were kind of making it very hard to find workers. And so it was an easy excuse to say that they can't find them. And that was Regis for you. He would push back very hard. He would make sure that you did all the right things you needed to do in stories. And it's a lesson that I've learned from him and others at the Journal. In many ways, I owe a lot of my career at the Journal to Rich. When 9/11 happened and he couldn't work for a period of time, I stepped in and did many things that Rich would have otherwise done. And it exposed me to other leaders at the Journal and got me, different assignments later. I got to know Rich very well when he was not back at work. Would visit him quite a bit in the hospital initially, and then when he went home, I remember taking my daughter Layla, who's 18 now. She was a baby, to visit with Janet and Rich over Saturday or Sundays, and we were so happy when he came back to work, fully recovered. And over the years, I remember laughing with him because behind that seriousness, there was always this great humor, and he enjoyed a joke, or he was very funny about it. And I hope that there are aspects of his journalism that I've always carried forward, whether it's being tough on reporters or whether it's trying to make stories better. I really miss Rich. I can't believe he's not here, but wherever he is, I hope he knows so many of us learned so much from him and are forever grateful for everything he has taught us, and in my case, for my career and for the friendship that I got from him. We miss you, Rich.
Hi, Jan. Hi, Nora. Hi, everyone. I'm Kathryn Kranhold. Rich was my friend, and he was also my editor on Deadline for many years. As I think Kathy Kranhold has put it recently, he saved many of us from writing millions when we meant billions, and how true that was. I was also with Rich on the morning of 9/11. We were together. Rich was leaving the World Financial Center. I was leaving my apartment, and I saw him and yelled out. We were together strategizing about how to cover the events when the towers were burning, and then the first tower fell, and the snowball of toxic debris came out of it, and so we kept moving by the Hudson River, and it was chaotic, and Rich was so calm and no nonsense, and it was such a comfort to me to be with Rich. And as we were walking, people were running by us with their children and their pets without shoes on. Rich paused and said, you go on. I need to find my daughter Nora and call my daughter Nora. So we did, and as we know, Rich ended up in the hospital within a couple weeks, and I think we didn't know if we'd see him again. So a year later, when we all moved back to the World Financial Center, Rich was there, and I know for one was so happy to see him. Anyway, cut to December, and I'm on. I get, I had a big birthday, and Rich sent me, a happy birthday on Facebook, and I was, of course, dumbfounded that Rich was on Facebook because Rich wouldn't go for those kind of bullshit Facebook type of things. So when I was talking to Jan this past week, I mentioned again how much that meant to me that Rich had sent a note, so on those Facebook happy birthdays. And she said, oh, I made him get on. And I thought, well, of course she did, And anyway, so thank you, Jan. And I hope that we can all be together soon and celebrate Rich's life and toast him. Thank you.
Hello. I feel so small next to the pain Jan and Nora must be enduring, and I know Rich loved you very much. I want to thank you for sharing him with us. My name is Kathryn Glancey, and Regis was already a fixture in the newsroom when I arrived, and we worked together for many years. Truly funny, a serious journalist, the kindest man. Regis brought many gifts to the newsroom. As a journalist, he was an impeccable editor, thoughtful, dedicated, creative, and savvy. His gift to us at the Journal over the 35 years was his presence, his spirit. He elevated every team he worked on by being himself and repeating what I can only see now in looking back was a remarkable pattern. Let's call it the slow reveal, the daily work, and the long view. First, the slow reveal. Rich was private. He did not want to have his picture taken. He could be quiet and appear curmudgeonly when you first met him. But he would forge a relationship with reporters and fellow editors, one story, one phone call, one lockup at a time. Rich seemed to reveal himself carefully, a stalwart, gallant, and generous, and charming. It seemed to me like Rich was using our daily work for a bigger purpose. It was a cycle I'd heard from many colleagues. Under deadline pressure, Rich was building relationships, building trust, and holding people to high standards. Sometimes gruff, but always kind, leading by example and teaching in conversation. And through the daily work, that slow reveal would yield into the long view, a true friendship. He would ask about your family and share updates about Nora's life. Regis's charm and wit and big laugh would create an environment where intense work could be accomplished without rancor. He would instigate inside jokes and create nicknames like Lola or Brighty and build a shared history that made you feel special. Repeat that pattern over decades with hundreds of colleagues, and there I think you have Regis's legacy at the Journal, long and deep. He added so much grace to our crazy days. The long view is how Regis's special combination of character and kindness and journalistic excellence defines and perpetuates the best of the Journal's culture. Thank you so much, Rich.
All right, if Jim Pensiero, are you on, Jim?
Yeah, I'm here, Bill.
Okay,
Ready?
You have the mic.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. First off, my deepest sympathy to Jan, Nora, and the rest of your family. I wrote too much, so I've been trying to edit myself down. Regis would be appalled with how much I wrote. He could tell very, very complicated stories in 6 or 7 lines. He could probably paraphrase the New Testament in a worldwide major, which was 15 lines, including the ital graph. I worked with Rich, and I always called him Rich. I never called him Regis, even though everybody else did. I met him, I worked with him for more than 30 years at the Journal, and I met him in the autumn of 1984 when we were both, I was brand new to the desk. He was always a beautifully dressed, slightly amped up guy. He's what people like me from Philadelphia, we call a no shit guy. And by that, I mean,
He's someone who tells it straight, who isn't afraid of conflict, if it's a fight worth fighting, and who meets something that's obvious to him, but maybe not so obvious to the person saying it, with a sharp no shit. I'm going to tell a couple of anecdotes that I think define our relationship, and they occurred in December of 1988. At the time, I was the night news editor. Rich wrote the worldwide column, which was an incredibly challenging job in that analog time. He went through reams of printouts from journal reporters and, you know, AP, other wire services, and he had to write, you know, probably in that column, maybe 12 items that were the most important items around the planet, the items that people who would read, you know, the worldwide column and the business and finance column could go into a meeting the next day and be prepared to look smart. And he made lots of people look smart. Anyway, that week of December 4th, and again, I overwrote this, but I'm going to read this part because I'll screw it up otherwise. The first story is from Tuesday, December 6th. And what happened that day, there were lots of things that happened that day, but the thing that that was a point of conflict between the two of us was that's the day that Roy Orbison died. And I think he died at who knows what time of day, but we found out about it in the evening. The first edition was already in, and Rich wanted to write what we called a died item, which was at the bottom of the column, which would say died, you know, Roy Orbison, blah, blah. And when we got into the evening, there was a very collaborative job between the night editor and the worldwide writer. And he said he wanted to write an item on Roy O. And I told him I didn't think that Roy O was newsworthy. Obviously, I hadn't been following the traveling Wilburys, and that, you know, it wasn't worth putting in the column. Rich knew a lot more about music than I did, and he wasn't happy. He told me to my face, because again, he was a no shit guy. He thought I was being smug, that Roy O was a popular icon, and that he usually agreed with my news judgment. He thought I was being an asshole on this one. And I took his critique, because what choice do you have with Rich? You take his critique. And he went back to his desk, and we didn't die Roy O. We moved on. 2 nights later, on December 8th, Thursday, Rich came over at about 9 at night. Presses for the first edition of the journal had been running more than an hour. And he was holding up a piece of AP copy on a speech that the new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had just made at the United Nations. And I'm going to kind of try to quote him, but it's more of a paraphrase. And I asked him about it, and he goes, you know, it's the usual UN shit. Peace in our time, the brotherhood of man, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The usual UN shit. I asked Regis, well, was there anything more to it than that? Because he was reading the top of the story. And when you work with Regis on that column, he was so into it. He was such a great judge of news. He was such an educated guy. And he would underline things in the copy because he was editing the AP. And he goes to about the middle of the copy and he says, oh yeah, well, you know, Gorbachev said he's pulling the Red Army out of Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Hungary. And the world has changed and it's time for the Soviet Union to change with it. Now, that was not the lead of the AP story, but there it was with his underline. And I said to him, holy shit, I think that's a big, big story. And he said to me, well, you know, that's what they always say. And I said, no, the Russians never, they talk about peace and brotherhood and nuclear disarmament, but they never actually mean it. When they say something like this, I'm willing to take a chance that he means it. So he looks at me and says, well, you know, it's your funeral, Jim. I said, write it. I'll rewrite the column, make it the lead. And the thing is, Regis said, fine. He goes back to his desk. He writes a new lead item. He writes down all the other items so that it fits. He remakes the whole column in like 20 minutes. And it turned out that that was the beginning and the end of the Soviet Union. And we looked pretty good that day. But that week represented everything I loved about Rich. I made a really bad call on Roy Orbison. We made a decent call on Gorbachev. He made his points on each one in no uncertain terms. And then he went back to his desk and he got the work done with the highest degree of professionalism I've ever seen in an editor. I trusted Rich on everything that was important at the Journal and about keeping the Journal an accurate and essential publication. We spent a lot of evenings together in those early years, and most of them were great. Regardless of what conflicts we had, we started the next day fresh, and we did good work. I love the man, and I'm very sorry about the call on Royo. God bless you. Thanks, Rick. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, that was a terrible call. So thanks for everyone for participating. And I think if Rich was here, he would say, get back to work.
Yeah.
So get back to work, everyone. Thanks again.